question about density. I'm just here to help.
Okay. All right, would someone like to move item 1? Moved by Councillor Gates, seconded by Councillor O'Neill. All in favour? Against? Carried. Item 3.
My question?
Yeah.
Sure. You can ask it. I was going to.
Did you want a presentation, Councillor Owen-Jones?
No.
Okay.
So,
So I spoke to Councillor McDonald this morning. She raised concerns with the density as well. So perhaps, Caitlin, if you could just talk us through the approach to density on this site.
Why are you glaring at me?
Sorry?
Yes. Okay. Through the chair, the application, the subject site is located within a residential density overlay of RD5, being a 1 bed per 50 square metres. The development is proposing a density of 1 bed per 13.35 square metres. So they are proposing an alternative outcome to density. When we look at density, we do take it to the purpose and the overall outcomes of the zone code, specifically looking at those ones that are more so in relation to when we're looking at design, character, amenity, and also infrastructure. So an assessment of this application did determine that the design of the proposal was appropriate for the character of the locality, and we also assessed the infrastructure within the local network, looking at sewer, water and transport, and those items, I guess, satisfied the overall outcomes.
So, Mr. Chair, I think part of the challenge is explaining to the residents how density interacts with the town plan, and that my understanding is that we've never had a successful appeal by refusing something just on density. Is that are you aware of any case where, because it complies with height, it complies with setbacks, it's what was intended under the scheme?
The technical people can probably speak better about this, but from my perspective, when you look at what the impacts are of the development, it's very hard to illustrate that when you've got a code accessible height that's forecast and it meets that, and it meets other parameters like car parking and setbacks, that it's hard to argue that the density is causing a negative impact off the site. And so from that perspective, density alone becomes a very difficult component of the planning factors, if you like, to try and argue alone.
Morning.
Councillor Young, we anticipated a short meeting, so we put an apology in for you.
Yes, thank you.
But we'll retract it later.
And I've got no conflicts.
Councillor Gates.
Chairman, is it a requirement of the state that we include density provisions in our planning scheme? Because I don't understand why I mean, as long as the networks can service the needs, that would always, I would imagine, be assessed with any application. So why do we have to include density when so often we get negative feedback because we're not meeting density, the densities outlined in city plan?
Do you want to speak to that, Alicia?
Through you, Mr Chair, Councillor Gates, it's not, and there's certainly other examples of other cities and regional areas that don't have density in the planning scheme, so it would be up to us as a city to formulate a city plan and work with the state government, but I don't think there's anything specific that says that we have to include it the way we've included it. That would obviously be up to negotiation with the state. They obviously look at their state interests. They would be very keen to look at density because that is a state interest in terms of how it goes back to their regional plan. But from a straight, does it have to be in there the way it is? My understanding is it doesn't.
Okay.
Well, in fact, so from a state interest perspective, they're more interested in a minimum density than a maximum.
So
if that, everyone needs to be careful what they wish for, probably. I would expect that really density is a measure of whether the toilets can flush and whether the taps will run. Like, after we go through the process of upgrading all of the stormwater, sewerage outflow capacity at some of our treatment plants, that would potentially give a huge uplift in density capacity. So,
And through you, Mr Chair, Councillor Gates also had a chat to Director Heaton yesterday about this particular development in terms of the treatment plant that it will hook into, and the Director did let me know that there is capacity in that area, and they work very closely with our team and our officers through the development process to make sure that everything is able to be accommodated.
Yeah. Look, I don't have a problem with it, and it's in a location that I think can support the type of development that's being proposed here. I just get a little weary of seeing the old density card thrown all the time, and I don't know why we actually have the stipulations we have within City Plan when so often we have a greater capacity available. Anyway.
okay, Councillor Vorster, sorry I didn't see you there out of the...
It's all right. I'm used to it by now. So, through you, Mr Chairman, perhaps to Councillor Gates, I mean, intriguing suggestion, and I've often been a fan of, I think, Miami's approach to town planning, which uses what's called a form-based code, which looks at how a development is sympathetic to the character of the area and the aspirations of the area, and is less prescriptive on things like setbacks and density, because it looks at how development fits in rather than create these really, I want to say arbitrary, because they are all arbitrary, but all these arbitrary measures that can then cause consternation in the community when we then fall back to performance outcomes. So I've always been a proponent of that form-based approach, which will overcome, I think, some of these concerns. But I also think with the planning scheme we've got, one way of addressing these issues, and I'm not necessarily running this up the flagpole, but to start to move density back into our triggers for impact assessment, because quite often, in my experience, height will be the impact trigger or the trigger for impact assessment, but not density. And I think if we were to assuage community concern, that's the point that we would address. It's not that we're refusing an application or that we'd be more likely to refuse it, but at least there'd be more rigour around the assessment of density being delivered far and above what I guess you could call the target density. Again, I'm not arguing for it, but I think if there was low-hanging fruit to assuage community concern, it would be changing that assessment threshold. That my 2 cents.
Okay, someone like to move it? Moved by Councillor Owen Jones. Question, Councillor Hamill.
Mr Chairman, through to the officer, I'm just looking at page 170, which is showing the shadow diagrams, and in particular the winter solstice diagrams. So in the notes, it's explaining that the Red Star site is going to receive 4 hours and 30 minutes of sunlight in its open private space. I'm just not sure if I've seen in a report where it specifically mentioned the hours and minutes that's going to be seen today, and that's seen as acceptable. So I'm interested, what number would have been not acceptable? Like, would 4 hours have been too little? Would 3.5 hours have been the number? Because if it's listing in there that 4.5 is acceptable, there must be a reverse number on that.
Yeah. Through the chair, we don't have, I guess, a set time or hours a day which we would consider to be acceptable. It's probably just taking into consideration the winter solstice, summer solstice, and the equinox period, and I guess sort of just having an overall look at those periods throughout the year, and then those hours which it's afforded throughout the day. So we do acknowledge within the winter periods that usually the shadow has that longer length of stay on properties. So it's just about trying to find that middle ground. So in short, no, we don't have a specific hours that are or aren't acceptable for shadowing.
And Mr Chairman, could I just get confirmation that I think I might have read that even if the AO setbacks would have been on this building, that the shadow impact would still be the same?
Through the chair, that's correct. The shadow diagrams, it may be a bit hard to, or a bit difficult to, I guess, really sort of visualise what they're trying to demonstrate. But if you do have a look, we've got the black outline, which is the proposed shadow of the proposed development. But then if you look at that, that red outline, that's where we've got, oops. Yeah, so the red outline is a compliant shadow. So that's site cover and setbacks and height, achieving the acceptable outcome.
On page 170, Councillor Hamill.
Yeah, That's the one I was looking at.
So, I mean, the difficulty is that green open space that's shown would still be in shadow, even probably in a 3-storey building, you know. So, it's a difficult kind of...
Chair, I have no problem with it, and what the building that's already there would be shadowing it as well. It was just interesting that a time frame was mentioned where normally it's not. Mr. Chair, a final question just in regards to open communal space. So maybe it's more of a question for you to the director, but why is the formula for the AO formula for communal space, like on this one on page 174, says that it'd be, you know, to meet AO 10.2 would require 1,500 square metres of communal open space. So that seems huge in this when the proposal is only for 298. So is that formula going to be adjusted in the future? Because we always see that it says it should be huge, but it turns out that we don't need anywhere near that much once we actually look at usage.
Through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor Hemmel, I believe, and don't quote me on it, it is in Amendment 2 and 3 where we have adjusted the communal open space. I don't know if anyone yet is. And that's been a long-running concern of officers, that the amounts were so high compared to what we actually believed and what we were getting on ground. So I think it is in 2 and 3, but I can take that on notice and confirm that.
Sure, the residents will enjoy their yoga lawn.
The yoga lawn.
The yoga lawn.
Councillor,
I got it.
Thanks, Chairman. In regards to shadow and things like that, I'm just referring to page 171 and the table at the bottom of the page which talks about the multiple accommodation code, and there's requirements there for certain outcomes to be achieved in building form, optimising orientation, privacy and utility of open space and so forth. And over the following page, there's a description of how this particular development meets those criteria. And I wonder if there's an obligation on us to contemplate how this development impacts upon or how those criteria would be assessed in terms of the neighbouring properties. So would we be achieving subtropical design excellence by providing significant shadow to the property to the south? And are we confirming the best privacy and utility of open space by having this building in its position as is anticipated with its height and shadow impacts and so forth? Is there an obligation on us to contemplate those sorts of things in terms of outside of the proposed built form?
Through you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks.
Councillor Young, it's my opinion that the PO4 relates to the particular site, the particular development. If you look all those, that's about actually how we can improve the actual design of the building. In relation to adjoining properties, we believe that's your site cover, your setback, those other AOs and POs, as opposed to this one, which is more design specific.
To the specific
site.
to the site and the application. Yeah. Thank you very much.
all right. Councillor Jones?
So I'm happy to move it. Clearly, it's code accessible. It's something that's been...
I'll second it and then you can speak to it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's something that's been long expected for Palm Beach. So in 2016, the height was lifted to allow for the 9 stories, but prior to that it was 7 stories in the 2003 scheme, and it was impact accessible for 7 stories in the 1994 scheme. So to some degree I'm surprised that it's come before us, because it actually complies, and it complies.
Well, it only comes before us because Councillor McDonald's position is that everything needs to come to committee.
And I thank her for that, but unfortunately not everything has come to committee because Councillor McDonald isn't here at committee talking to it. So if she wanted to come to committee so that we could discuss it, and if there were issues with it, it would be helpful if she was here, but she's not. So the scheme requires 57 car spaces. It's got 72 car spaces. Density is the only thing that doesn't strictly comply with the scheme, but then when you go up through the various levels of assessment, it clearly does comply. So I think it's beholden on us as elected representatives, including Councillor McDonald to help explain to the population that she represents in that Palm Beach area that there's a scheme that we have to comply with and it has to be assessed, and that's what we're doing. So, if we have to have the same conversation at full council, we should. But so we get criticised all over the city for density that's happening in Palm Beach, and Palm Beach's density is no different than the growth that's happening throughout the rest of the city. So that's my 10 cents worth, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak for or against? You happy with that closed, Councillor Owen Jones? Right, we'll take the vote. All in favour? Against? Carried. Councillor Peter Young voted in the negative. Thank you. Item 4. Did you? I don't think we need a presentation, but Councillor Vorster had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just through you to the Director, I just want to make sure that I'm properly understanding this body of work. And I'll just say from the outset, this is a good example of how the council identified an issue on the back of community feedback, brought it to the table, and city officers have gone away and done, I feel, a great job and prepared, at least what they've done is they have engaged with the industry, they've engaged with all of the other prevailing building codes and regulatory instruments, and they've presented us, I think, with a very focused set of recommendations that can meet these concerns in the community. So I think the process has been excellent, and I really appreciate the Director's oversight of this body of work. Plainly, though, our ability to enforce certain building methods is fettered by the fact that there are multiple options for the way that these basements are constructed. And ultimately, those who are carrying out the construction side of development will still have choices, right, despite the body of work that we've prepared. I just want to get a sense on the dealings that officers had with master builders of Queensland, I think, around their willingness to opt for the more expensive approach, which in our view will mitigate some of these concerns. Is it a reasonable cost that they feel as though the industry can absorb?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. The discussions with master builders took place some time ago after the first report went to council. There was a brief media article that included the master builders. So I went and met with the local regional manager at the time and discussed this. And the feedback that I gave him was the feedback that we got from a few of the builders, that they're actually at a disadvantage with the current requirements, because although they're using best practice, there's some builders who don't. So they're not as competitive. So master builders initially, they had some hesitation, but when I discussed that point with them, they were in favour of this type of approach.
Right. So the report talks to, I suppose, the opportunity that may exist to have the superior construction approach specified at the time buildings are designed, right? And in my experience, that takes place at the architectural stage.
Yes.
Right, as opposed to the construction stage. So I'd like to get a sense of how, as a directorate, we might engage with the architectural community that may be involved in regular developments along the coastline to inform them of this policy position, as opposed to, your typical proponents and the construction firm. Like, is that worth doing? And do we have the capacity to do that?
Yeah, that's definitely worth doing. Sorry, I might just take one step back and just introduce myself properly. Okay. Darren Wright is my name, and I'm the principal building surveyor at the City of Gold Coast. So I've had a lot to do with this report and going through it. But yes, definitely providing this information to industry is one of the key parts of it, because if the engineers are aware of these design requirements, the architects, the draftsmen, all of those involved in that design process, it can be designed for at a very early stage. So that's one of the benefits. If we can give that proactive involvement early by letting those various institutes become aware of the changes before it becomes as an actual project to them, then we can get ahead of the curve and forewarn them.
So, Director, is that something we've got the capacity to be doing?
Through you, Mr Chair, Councillor Foster, absolutely. We've also got our database where we send out our industry alerts. So if this is moved by council on Tuesday, we would send an alert out through that process. We're also happy to let the presidents of the various associations that Darren referred to know as well.
So, Mr Chairman, through you, I suppose lastly, my sense of it is we would have difficulty conditioning a specific and preferred form of construction because they're not referred to in the prevailing building codes. Do you think there is sufficient merit to perhaps make a submission to those responsible for the building codes to effectively draw their attention to our body of work and perhaps suggest that some of our findings be included in a future update so that if included in the building code, we're on more, excuse my pun here, more on firm ground, should we wish to condition developments to use this construction method? Because I guess we can't condition it because it's not referred to in the code. We've done a great body of work. Can we or should we be lobbying for the code to be changed so that we can get in the business of conditioning our preferred approach?
Through you, Mr Chair, we can include in the stakeholder engagement that we'll do, we can write an additional letter. Darren works with the building industry, so we can certainly share that with them and encourage them perhaps to consider it in a further review of their codes, but that's probably the extent.
So, Mr Chairman, through you to perhaps Alicia or Mick or Darren, who would be the responsible body that would have carriage over this part of the building code? Just for clarity.
Sure. Through you, Mr Chair. There's a number of agencies that deal with building code regulations. The Australian Building Codes Board deal with it at a federal level, but generally it's for the safety of the occupants within the building that building law is focused on. So it would be difficult at that level. At a state level, there's various Queensland development codes that are addressed to deal with particular problems within Queensland. So that may be the best approach.
And sorry, what's the agency or department who would be responsible for that?
The Housing, Public Works and Energy.
So the Department of Housing, Public Works and Energy.
Yes.
So, Mr Chairman, I'm not sure what your disposition is, but I wouldn't mind moving the officer recommendation with a second part, which essentially calls for the city to provide a copy of the report to the relevant department for consideration in a future update to the relevant building codes. So that the city provide a copy of this report to the Department of Housing, Public Works and Energy for consideration. Public Works and Energy. For consideration during an update of the relevant building codes. Yeah. So if there's a second, I'm happy to talk to her. I think that's a good idea. Yeah, that's better.
Young, followed by Councillor Hamill.
And thank you. I'm through the chair. I'm not sure who to direct it at, but if with the sheet piling as opposed to the board type piling, is there one particular group of contractors that would take care of one type and another the other, so that if we sort of pushed along to say that we want to have all, say, sheet piling, that we are actually going to burden those companies that do the board piling, or is it potentially company A is doing both and it's just whatever is conditioned within the approval?
Through you, Mr Chair. My understanding is that companies tend to do both of the types of piling, so that they don't particularly deal with one type, whether it's sheet piling, but they will deal with both, because on certain sites may lead themselves more to one type than the other type in some situations, or they'll actually do both types of piling on different sites.
Mm-hmm. Another question, and is that the type of piling they do, is that potentially to do with setbacks and that, with the size of the sites, as to why they will choose one over the other?
I think it's more down to cost, but I'm sorry, I can't speak to particular setbacks. The inquiries that I have made is that it makes very little difference, but I'm sorry, I can't provide an expert opinion on that.
Just need to know. Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Hamill.
Mr Chairman, I'm interested in, so this is focusing fairly strongly on the industry and engineers and architects beforehand doing the right thing, but if it becomes part of development conditions, then there's a compliance aspect as well needs to be considered. So I'm interested in, if this did become a development condition or something along this line, and then someone puts a complaint in from a neighbouring building, what is our actual capability from a development compliance point of view to enforce this kind of development condition if it was ever introduced?
Through you, Mr Chairman. This is one of the real positives from this change, in that we're requesting that the builder actually provide monitoring for the site, and because we have a particular value that needs to be achieved and it's been recorded, that the compliance officers from council, when they attend site, can actually compare the logs that have been taken on site from the design values. So very clearly we can see if there's a breach or not. So it empowers council to act in a lot of situations where currently it's a lot more difficult.
It was just the part out of it that I didn't quite get from that part there. Just finally on that, Mr Chair, would we have, I see from time to time where in other industries where there's self-regulation or self-monitoring of these things, that there's always conjecture around that they'll tend to put telemetry monitoring stations in places that best suits them. Would we have any kind of oversight of when this management plan is put in place of saying, no, we want that telemetry station put there or there, to make sure we get the results where we're looking for them?
Through you, Mr Chairman, the way I understand it, the acoustic consultant will provide the locations on where the monitoring is going to be, and that's assessed by some people within the Lifestyle and Community Directorate who have some acoustic knowledge as part of the process. So if there was an issue with the location, it can be stopped at that approval stage. But I'm sorry, I don't have that kind of knowledge technically on the location of them and just how that effect works.
And just a bonus, Mr Chair, would those monitoring stations, would the data from that be public information at all? So instead of the community having to contact their local councillor or contact council thinking that there's a vibration issue, would they be able to see that data themselves and then not have to contact us if they can clearly see that it's under the prescribed limits?
Through you, Mr Chair, I guess the vibration management plan that gets approved before they start construction would be on PD Online, but the logging information wouldn't be, I guess, readily accessible, but could be provided at request.
No, I just wonder why it couldn't be public. What would be, if it's there and open and a city officer can come in any time and see it, why should the proponent be scared of that information being available to the public to be able to tap into any time and perhaps avoid a lot of time being spent internally going around in a circle just to look at it? Yeah, acute vibration.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I guess the compliance system is driven by complaints. So we'll have all these monitoring loggers in place, and if that development proceeds without anyone complaining, there's probably a chance our compliance officers might not need to attend that site. So I guess it's just a practical issue of that there'll be live logging of vibration and noise, and how you get that live logging results immediately onto a PD online is a difficult thing. But if there's a complaint, all that information will be freely available when and if asked for.
Just for context, Mr. Chair, I was thinking probably more broadly outside of vibration telemetry to other telemetry in other industries, that maybe a bit more public information being there could reduce a lot of complaints to the city and a lot of internal time being spent looking at things we don't need to.
Yep.
Thanks, Chairman. I just wanted to make sure that we'd covered all the issues that were originally anticipated with this matter. Was there a concern about slumping or something like that? Obviously, we're dealing with vibration and noise, but I just had the impression or the recollection that at the time there'd been some concerns about slumping of the subsidence, yeah, caused by adjacent works. And but then I looked at the resolutions previously, and there was no particular reference to that side.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we have just acted on the resolution. Darren might jump in a little bit here, but I guess the point of this is to manage the amenity impacts of construction, in particular vibration and noise. So actual other damage and physical damage caused by a developer is generally a civil issue, which this policy doesn't address. So.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, it's a nice side effect that by controlling vibration, that we also control the structural issues indirectly.
Through you, Chair, I think that was that subject was something that was brought up by Councillor McDonald. There was a problem with some properties that she was talking about in Palm Beach, and I think this was and she really wanted to see this report as well. So.
It must be good. It's a blue-green team. Yeah, look, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to respond to the point, the very good point that Councillor Young raised. I mean, for me, I saw the vibration and construction amenity issues and the subsidence issues as one of the same. So I've said a few times from the chair, liquefaction. Liquefaction is a process where vibration actually undermines the structure of soil, and particularly sandy soil. And typically in the most acute case, if you've got an earthquake that's caused vibration, sand that's otherwise solid can turn into a liquid consistency, and then you end up with all sorts of structural faults. So mindful that Councillor McDonald raised the issue of subsidence, when I considered the report and saw vibration, I really linked vibration with the impact on the structural integrity of the surrounding sand, and saw this as a way of addressing potential issues of liquefaction that lead to subsidence. So I saw the report as dealing with both, even though it didn't make explicit mention of Councillor McDonald's concerns.
All right, anyone else got any questions? Councillor Vorster, did you want to speak further? No, thank you.
No.
Councillor Vorster, did you want to say anything?
Oh, look, again, I just want to give residents some comfort that when there are real concerns about the way that development and construction unfolds, and there's genuine merit to get to the bottom of a problem, that we've got a preparedness as a council to go into bat for them. And here's an example where legitimate concerns from predominantly the Palm Beach community have been interrogated by committee, by city officers. We've worked with stakeholders, and potentially there'll be benefits for the whole of Queensland where development may occur on the coastline. So we're not deaf to community concerns. We're very alert to it. And I think this is a major win that will hold the city in good stead as development continues to unfold where it ought to unfold over the next few decades.
Yes, I distinctly remember spending time with Councillor McDonald in Palm Beach, actually visiting some of the affected properties. So, like, it is a real issue on the ground, and so I'm pleased that we've been able to bring a solution to the table. Anyone else want to speak for or against? Otherwise, we'll take the vote. All in favour? Against? Carried. Right, any items of general business, councillors? Did you want to close the meeting first, or just... so any other general business? All right, meeting closed at 9:38.